Hey there, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the animation blueprint and how the animation blueprint has its own event graph. And it also has something called an anim graph, which allows us to be able to change between different animations. Right now, we're interested in changing between idle and walking animations so that our arms can start moving in such a way that looks like we're walking whenever we're moving around. So let's dive in. Now, I'm here in our first-person shooter project, and right now, if I just hit play and I move around, our arms are staying in that idle animation, and that's because we assigned that idle animation to our mesh in the character blueprint. And just to remind you, if I open up the FPS character blueprint and I select our mesh component here, we'll see under animation that animation mode has a drop-down, and we selected Use Animation Asset, and we chose this animation arms idle to play. But we'd like to make an animation blueprint so that we can use logic to determine which pose our character should be in at any given point in time. So let's do that. I'm here in the character folder, which is in our blueprints folder, and I'm going to right-click and create a new folder, and I'm going to call this animation. And we can keep our animation-related assets that we create here in our animation folder. Now here in the animation folder, I'd like to create the animation blueprint. Now we can right-click, and with this menu that pops up, there's the animation option. If we hover over that, we see all sorts of animation-related assets that we can create. Now we're interested in the animation blueprint. If I click on that, I get a new pop-up that's asking me for some information before it creates the animation blueprint. It's asking which parent class we should use, and it's also asking for the target skeleton. And I see that there are 3 different skeletons here in my project. Now, it's very important that we choose the correct skeleton that our character mesh is using. So before we create this animation blueprint, let's figure out which skeleton that is. So let's click Close for the little menu and go back to the FPS character blueprint. And with the mesh selected, I can scroll down to the mesh section and see the skeletal mesh property. And I can click the browse icon and I'll be taken to the folder that contains this mesh. I can double click to open it up, and I'm now in the skeletal mesh editor with this asset opened up. Now a skeletal mesh has a skeleton assigned to it. And in the Asset Details panel, we can scroll down to the Mesh section and we see a skeleton property. And it's showing us which skeleton this mesh is using. Now there's also a Skeleton Tree tab. If we click on that, we can see all of the bones in the skeleton. A skeleton is simply a hierarchy of bones that our mesh is skinned to. That means if we select one of the bones and we rotate it here in the mesh editor, our mesh will rotate along with the bone. And these bones are hierarchical, meaning all bones that are attached to any given bone will rotate along with it. I can select the lower arm L bone and rotate that, and I'll see that all parts of the mesh associated with that bone and below, namely the hands and fingers, are moving along with it. So animation assets are simply moving these bones, and our mesh is moving along with the bones. So now that we know which skeleton our mesh is using, it's this SK Mannequin arm skeleton, this is the skeleton we must choose when we create our animation blueprint. So I'm going to close out of the mesh editor and go back into our folder that we created called animation, and right-click again and select animation and animation blueprint. Now down here in the target skeleton section, we can select SK Mannequin arms skeleton. Now in the top portion for the parent class, we're going to choose anim instance. This is the C++ class that drives our animation blueprint behind the scenes. So we can click anim instance, and with our SK Mannequin arms skeleton selected for the target skeleton, we can click OK. And now we have an animation blueprint here in the animation folder. Let's rename this FPS _ anim BP. So we have an animation blueprint. Let's double-click this and open it up, and we see something that looks similar to our other blueprints. Namely, we have this graph here, but there are some differences. An animation blueprint has two different types of graphs. It has an anim graph and an event graph. The event graph is just like the event graph in our character blueprint. There are events and nodes, and we can place logic here to set values of variables and things like that. The anim graph, however, has to do with animation poses. We can add animation assets here in this graph, and whatever we have hooked up to this output pose node will result in our mesh morphing to that particular pose. So let's see how this works. At the lower left, we have an Asset Browser tab. Make sure to click the Asset Browser tab, and now you can see all the different animations that use the skeleton that we associated with this animation blueprint. Let's click on Arms Idle and drag it in. And we see that this animation now exists in the anim graph as a node, and the output execution pin in the shape of a little person represents the animation pose. If we click and drag and hook it up to output pose and click compile, then any mesh that's using this animation blueprint will now use the arms idle pose. So I'm going to click the tab at the top and drag and dock it up next to FPS character. So I can go back into the FPS character blueprint, and with our mesh selected, scrolling up to the animation section, for animation mode, I can click the dropdown and change this to use animation blueprint. And now for the anim class, I can click the dropdown and choose FPS anim BP. That's the animation blueprint that we just created. Now, clicking the viewport, I can see that the mesh is using the arms idle animation because that is the animation pose that we set up here in the anim graph in our animation blueprint. But instead, if we were to drag in a different animation, such as arms walk, and hook that up to the output pose, we can click compile and go back to our character blueprint, and we see that our arms are now animating as if they're walking. That's because our mesh is using whatever pose information the animation blueprint is providing. This is very powerful because we can choose to play different poses at different times depending on what's happening in our game. So for your challenge, I'd like you to change the animations that we have plugged into the output pose. Drag in various animation assets and plug them up, compile, and take a look at the viewport in the character blueprint or simply playtest to see the character arms animating with those various animations. Pause the video and give this a try. Okay, so let's take a look at the various animations that we have in this project. I can simply drag one of these in and hook it up to output pose and compile. And now in FPS character, we see that the arms are animating according to that particular animation asset. And if we go and hit play, we see that our character is using that animation and it's looping over and over. Let's take a look at one more. I'm going to select arms sprint and hook that one up and compile. And now I see that our character arms are in the sprinting animation. So in summary, we created an animation blueprint, and we saw that whatever we have hooked up to the output pose in the anim graph is the pose that our mesh will be in the game. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the animation blueprint's event graph, where we can set variables that we'll use to drive various animation poses. I'll see you soon.